In March 2014, Tammy Huntsman agreed to take care of 3 children. One was Delylah Tara. She was Tammy's niece and she was aged 2. Another was her nephew, Shaun. He was aged 5. These two, Delylah and Shaun, are the victims. You also had a third, who was another niece. She was 8 years old. Now the 3 children lived with Huntsman in an apartment in California. Also living in the apartment at the time was Tammy's husband, her teenage son, and her 10-year-old twins. And for the purpose of this video, the surviving niece, the one that's 8 years old, throughout this video, I'm going to refer to her as just the niece. Now Gonzalo Curiel, who was then 16 years old, became friends with Tammy's teenage son. Gonzalo began to regularly stay at Tammy's apartment. Gonzalo and Tammy soon became romantically involved. Tammy's husband moved out and her son was sent to juvenile hall. Gonzalo started sleeping with Tammy in the master bedroom. You cheeky bastard. Gonzalo and Tammy began to severely abuse the niece, Delylah, and Shaun. The abuse included shouting at the children, keeping them in a cold bathroom with no clothes, spraying them with water, forcing them to sit in wet clothes, withholding food, and zip tying their hands together behind their backs or to the bed. The kids were being left alone, often for days at a time. The CPS were called by family members. Perhaps there was a half-dozen calls from teachers, family members, and neighbors to the Child Protective Services. These calls were about the conditions at the house and the obvious mistreatment of the kids. Investigators located video of 3-year-old Delylah standing on a bed, facing a wall with her hands behind her back, appearing to be tied. Images were shown of the niece sitting naked in the bathroom of the apartment where the family stayed. There were also images of Gonzalo and Tammy kissing and playing in bed together. Tammy was in her 40s, Gonzalo was barely 16. In fact, he was underage. Tammy's other children witnessed some of the abuse firsthand. They saw Tammy and Gonzalo abuse the children about 15 times. They said they remembered the kids getting bruises on their face, on their backside, and on their legs. One instance where Gonzalo abused Shaun and the little boy yelled at him to stop. Another incident, the niece was punished for wetting herself. It was reported the kids were sneaking food like bagels and fruit bars from the kitchen because they were never fed. There was also a 3-foot by 6-foot bathroom that became a torture chamber. Tammy and Gonzalo used shower heads on the children. Some nights, the kids were locked inside the bathroom and forced to sleep in wet clothing as punishment. After Thanksgiving in 2015, Gonzalo and Tammy abruptly packed up some belongings and drove to Northern California. Tammy's children and the niece were passengers in the vehicle. Delylah and Shaun were not. When the niece asked Tammy, "Where is Delylah? Where is Shaun?" Tammy said she had put them up for adoption. During the drive, there was a bad smell coming from a storage bin in the back of the vehicle. While in Northern California, Tammy rented a storage unit in Redding. At the storage unit, Gonzalo and Tammy took items out of the vehicle, including the plastic storage bins, and put them into the storage unit. Thereafter, the bad smell from the car dissipated. Tammy and Gonzalo eventually arrived in the small Northern California town of Quincy, which is near Redding, where Tammy attempted to establish a residence. While there, a friend of theirs called the Child Protective Services because the niece was extremely thin and bruised. County Sheriff Greg Hagwood said she weighed around 40 pounds, had broken bones in her shoulder, she had broken fingers, a dislocated jaw, and teeth that were missing or loose. She reportedly had open sores and was infested with lice. He said the little girl had been subjected to the most unspeakable measure of torture for an extended period of time. After being questioned, Gonzalo admitted some culpability in causing these injuries to the niece. Gonzalo eventually stated he wanted a lawyer present, so his interview was terminated and he and Tammy were arrested. Tammy was taken to jail and Gonzalo was taken to a juvenile detention facility. Now later, Tammy's mother phoned the sheriff's department to inquire about Shaun and Delylah's whereabouts. The detective with whom she spoke said he had no knowledge of those children. You see, at this point, he only knew about the niece. Tammy's mother urged the detective to find them, and she expressed concern that the children may be dead. The detective began an immediate and urgent effort to try to find them both. A sheriff's deputy questioned Tammy, who stated that some agency had taken custody of the children. Feeling that the investigation had reached an impasse and worried that the weather in Quincy was very cold, the deputy called the juvenile detention center where Gonzalo was being held. He called them to have somebody talk to Gonzalo and see if he knew where these children were. The deputy spoke with the juvenile detention center supervisor and instructed him to ask about the kids. Don't ask any other questions about this case. The juvenile detention supervisor and an assistant interviewed Gonzalo in the visitation room at the facility. During the interview, the questioning focused solely on the location of the two children. At one point, Gonzalo laid his head down and acted like he was trying to sleep. The supervisor then kicked the leg of the table, trying to wake him up. The supervisor and his assistant stated that they spoke calmly to Gonzalo without accusing him of any wrongdoing or threatening him. Gonzalo initially claimed he had no idea where the children are, but he then stated that the children were in a storage unit in Reading and gave a detailed description of its location. Law enforcement arrived at the storage facility without a search warrant. The assistant manager, who was on site, received a call from the owner stating that the police were looking for her. This assistant manager then discovered officers scaling the rock wall to enter the facility. The assistant manager took police to Tammy's storage unit. They immediately went inside because it was a life-saving effort at that time, and they still had some hope that these children were still alive. Now, inside of the storage unit, officers found Delylah and Shaun's bodies in a plastic storage container. They immediately stepped out, secured the scene, and obtained a search warrant. 4 days after the bodies were discovered, Tammy's vehicle was searched by the police. Inside of the driver's side door, they found a receipt for a storage unit in Reading, a business card with information about the storage unit, and the storage unit lease agreement. The business card reflected the name of the facility, its address, the unit number, and the monthly payment. The search of the vehicle was delayed because of uncertainty over which agency had jurisdiction over the case. While the vehicle was recovered by the police department, it was determined that the children likely had died back at the old residence, and so the investigation, including the vehicle, was handed over to that police department. It was always intended that the vehicle would be searched. Tammy and Gonzalo were eventually charged with first-degree murder in the death of the two young children. Now, in the trial, lawyers on both sides painted very different pictures of Gonzalo. Prosecutors spent more than an hour laying out what led up to the deaths of Delylah and Shaun and the abuse of the niece. In terms of the children's own story, their biological mother died in a car crash, and they were brought to California because their father went to jail, hence why Tammy started taking care of them. Now, prosecutor Steve Somers said things went downhill after Gonzalo moved in to the family residence, because this is when Tammy's husband left. Prosecutor said the kids were starved, sometimes just fed a piece of fruit every day, and were kept locked in a bathroom and abused. During opening statements, Gonzalo sat quietly next to his attorney. He told the jurors that the facts would prevail through various witnesses. The prosecution also called witnesses. These were people who knew the children personally and testified about the physical deterioration over a span of months. Their paternal grandmother talked about the kids and the death of the children's mother. She said she would send gifts on their birthdays and holidays. She said she even babysat Tammy when she was a child, but hadn't seen her for many years. Tammy had called the children's grandmother asking her for money when she said she never sent. You also had school teachers who taught the victims, as well as a school nurse, testifying in court. They talked about how the children were losing weight and wore the same clothes to school every day. They were also dirty and had lice. Several of the school staff bought the kids clothing with their own money, but testified they never saw the children wear these new clothes. They talked about how they went from only missing a few days of school one year to 17 absences in another. One of the teachers said she met Tammy several times at parent-teacher conferences. She said Tammy seemed interested in the children and willing to take them and excited to care for them. Another woman said she was Shaun's first grade teacher. Shaun came to school emotional and wanted hugs. She said her gut told her something was wrong, but the child never expressed what kind of nightmare he was living in. One of their teachers at the elementary school testified that the siblings were in such bad shape that she called her father hoping he would adopt them. She felt like the children were dying in front of her. While Tara played during recess, Shaun would frequently sleep under a tree. And during 2015, teachers, neighbors, family members, all of them called the Child Protective Services several times, but Shaun and his sister was never taken away. Now, Tammy herself pled guilty and wrote a confession detailing what the murder victims had to endure during their tragically short lives. This is what the confession wrote. I willfully failed to provide adequate food to the niece, Shaun and Delylah, causing them to suffer from starvation. I willfully failed to provide adequate shelter for the niece, Shaun and Delylah, causing them to suffer hypothermia from being confined in a wet cement shower for extended periods of time. I violently abused the niece, Shaun and Delylah. I willfully permitted Gonzalo to do each of the above listed acts. I intended to take the lives of Shaun and Delylah. I intended to inflict extreme physical pain and suffering on the niece, Shaun and Delylah, for a sadistic purpose. Shaun and Delylah died during the commission of the crime of torture. So Tammy confessed, right? And she was convicted. Gonzalo, however, chose to go on trial, and the prime witnesses were all the other children who lived in the house. And to them, the final abuse happened on Thanksgiving Day. Shaun and Delylah were murdered, and their sister, the niece, was abused until she was barely clinging to life. Prosecutors said that instead of taking the children to the hospital, Gonzalo and Tammy decided to get rid of them, and they didn't plan on the niece surviving. This is when Gonzalo and Tammy loaded the car with the children and the dead bodies. The other children testified that the odor went away after Tammy and Gonzalo unloaded a large container from the SUV and placed it in the storage unit, where the bodies were later found. According to the prosecutors, Gonzalo left fingerprints on duct tape used to seal the storage container. The same day, Tammy arrived in Quincy and rented an apartment. One person who met the family was alarmed by the 9-year-old, the niece that is, her fragile condition, and called the sheriff's office. Tyler Herman, who was a rookie at the sheriff's department, was sent to conduct a welfare check. He found Tammy, Gonzalo, and the other kids. According to the district attorney's office, they all appeared well cared for and healthy. Rather than leave, Tyler inquired if there was another child present. After some prodding, Tammy led Tyler to a car and indicated there was a child inside who was fine and did not like to be around other people. Tyler saw that the niece was alone, lying on the floorboards of a locked SUV. Her collar was broken, she had black eyes, and she was covered in bruises. Tyler testified in court, and prosecutors played audio tapes of the softened spoken girl answering the deputy's questions. The girl told Tyler that Gonzalo had been abusing her for a long time. Tammy tried to explain it away by saying the girl fell on the ground to get attention, and that she likes to be alone. Her most recent injuries happened during a hiking trip, when the girl threw herself on the ground. This was Tammy's explanation. Now, a doctor was unable to get her bones back in place. This is what Tammy said. Tyler, however, did not believe that story. When Tyler separately questioned Gonzalo, asking him what happened to the girl, Gonzalo answered, "I just squeezed her in the arm. That's it. I squeezed her a couple of times." Tyler arrested Tammy and Gonzalo on suspicion of child abuse. Now, let me reiterate to you, the Monterey County Department of Social Services received 5 referrals of suspected child neglect to the home. One of those cases, however, appeared in the system as an open case, even though the investigation into the allegations had been completed. You see, in August 2015, a social worker was unable to complete her assessment due to the family being evasive. The only observation of possible neglect was that the children were really skinny, that Delylah was infested with lice, and the house was infested with cockroaches. Well, what more evidence do you need, Muppet? After this visit, the final recommendation was to do nothing unless the family came back to the attention of the department. Still, a dozen attempts by social workers to contact Tammy were unsuccessful. The next time the department would be made aware of possible neglect was in December 2015, when some random caller reported that the children were missing, and that's when days later their bodies were found. Social services themselves had access to the complete family history, including the home of the biological parents before they moved in with Tammy. The children, even before back then, had a history of allegations and findings of abuse. For example, alleged physical abuse and neglect in 2010. This was found to be inconclusive. There was alleged neglect in 2011. This was listed as substantiated, but nothing was done. More neglect in 2013. Nothing was done. More neglect in 2014. Nothing was done. And that's just for Shaun and Delylah. In fact, if we go back to 1998, there was alleged emotional abuse listed as substantiated. Nothing was done. Sexual abuse in 98. Nothing was done. All these reports, and the children were failed over and over again. So, regarding the sentencing, the Monterey District Attorney, Filippo, announced that Tammy, who was 42, was sentenced by Judge Pamela Butler for 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances and 2 counts of torture in the 2015 deaths of Shaun and Delylah Tara. Tammy also pled guilty to 1 count of torture and 1 count of child abuse. The judge ordered Tammy to serve 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, 3 additional consecutive life terms, and 9 more years. She waived all writs and appeals and will never be released from prison. The niece, who survived the horrific child abuse, wrote a letter to the court forgiving Tammy. She said, "It's not good to dislike someone for a long time, so at this time I would love to say I forgive Tammy." The judge herself admonished Tammy for not doing anything to prevent the mental and physical abuse she believed was carried out mostly by Gonzalo. Tammy's ex-husband said she and Gonzalo both deserved the death penalty. He said Gonzalo had a weird look in his eyes from the beginning. He had a weird blank stare, like he had no soul, like he could take a life and not think twice. Regarding Gonzalo himself, he was found guilty by a jury of all charges after deliberating for less than 2 hours. Gonzalo was a sadistic person who enjoyed controlling and hurting children, the judge said. Pamela Butler, the judge, sentenced him to 2 terms of life in prison. Now, despite the sentence, prosecutor Steve Somers said California law dictates Gonzalo, who was 20 when sentenced, will have a chance to seek parole in 2040. This is because he was a minor when the crimes were committed. And to conclude, what can you say? There's nothing to say. They're never getting out of prison. And the interesting thing about this case, despite all the crimes, the disgusting way they treated these children, spending the rest of their lives in prison and probably never be released, was probably the right outcome. Either that or the death penalty. Anyway, comment, tell me what you think.